Congressman, thank you for coming and agreeing to talk to us today. I've been looking forward to a chance to meet again and to get a chance to hear your thoughts on a number of things. So I'll just jump right in, if that's all right
Sure.
with you. You've been a strong supporter of the president on a number of pieces of legislation that I think have been central parts of his program. And I'd like to talk to you about a couple of those. The first one would be the Affordable Health Care Act, which you voted for, passed the House, and then was stymied in the Senate. So how far would that have gone to fix the problems with Obamacare, and what would you like to see happen now?
Sure.
Or in the next session of Congress?
Sure. Well, first, look, I support the president when he's right, and I don't support him when he's wrong. And we'll hopefully talk a little about the Chesapeake Bay program, where he and I completely disagree about the way to go forward with that. But let's talk about health care. Obviously, I've practiced medicine for a long time, 38 years, licensed to practice this year. And, I have a feeling that the average person is pretty worried about it. They are. They're worried about it because it's more expensive than it needs to be. They're limited in which physicians they can see and which providers they can see. They're being told that they have to pay higher deductibles, more premiums, more co-pays. And I think the Affordable Care Act, although it did expand the availability of insurance to a larger number of Americans, obviously the costs, it did nothing to control cost. And, it's literally called the Affordable Care Act, but it really didn't do anything to make care more affordable. In fact, by the way it was set up, really the insurance companies, really are the ones who made a lot of money. If you look at how the insurance stocks, for instance, performed since the Affordable Care Act was passed, it way surpasses what the stock market did. Way surpasses what insurance companies did. Way surpasses what any healthcare provider companies did. So the money appeared to be made by the insurance companies, and they did it through high premiums. That way doesn't work. In Maryland, we did it a different way, and that's the way the American Health Care Act was going to do it, which is to say that if you take individuals who unfortunately have medical problems, so their premiums, they will cost more to take care of, but we have to take care of them. It developed mechanisms that encourage high-risk pooling mechanisms or reinsurance mechanisms, which is exactly what we did in Maryland to solve the problem this year. So actually, the American Health Care Act actually was pretty forward-looking in that way. It actually pointed us in the direction that Maryland actually took to a system which basically will mean that every person with pre-existing conditions are covered. That was in the American Health Care Act, and that if you did not have one of these pre-existing conditions, your rates would not be as high, because the premiums of the people with these conditions would be bought down by basically everybody contributing to help pay for that cost. That's where the Affordable Care Act failed. That's why our premiums, again, on the exchange, thank goodness, they're now stabilized, but that's stable at a level 2 to 3 times higher than they were before the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you. I'd like to pursue that a little bit further, because I think this idea both of a more efficient reinsurance market, the profits of the insurance companies, and then the notion of forcing people to buy insurance when they would voluntarily take on the risks themselves is kind of was a troubling feature of the Affordable Health Care Act. And I'm not sure whether you were saying that you thought that it was a good idea to increase the risk pooling through mandatory coverage of everyone, or whether you still see other ways of kind of funding existing conditions and high-risk patients without increasing the premiums or mandating coverage on young people who were perfectly happy with much skimpier insurance and probably were making a rational decision given the likelihood of their needing health care.
Well, at first, I think what we have to do is we have to encourage people to have health insurance. And you don't encourage, there are a couple of ways to encourage. One is you can pass the Affordable Care Act and make you do it and pay a penalty and make you buy an expensive policy. That doesn't work. I mean, the fact of the matter is millions and millions of Americans chose to pay the penalty rather than buy the insurance because it was not affordable. So I think you have to look for solutions where we make the insurance affordable, where we pool the risk. Again, we know that a very small percentage of patients actually consume most of the healthcare dollar. We have to spread that risk among the entire population. That's where the Affordable Care Act failed. It spread that risk among only the individuals in the individual risk pool. That's a mistake. That's a health policy mistake, because it predictably will result in much higher premiums. So if you didn't get a subsidy on that individual exchange, you were paying a lot of money for insurance that you probably wouldn't buy that level of insurance if you paid for yourself. I do believe, and I've called for the idea of perhaps what we used to call major medical, which are the insurance policies that cover only the large medical expenses, that we should make those policies very available. And maybe that's, if you want to say mandate it, what you do is you give someone a tax credit if they buy that policy. Tax credits almost equal to the price of the policy, so that what we call rational economic actors would actually buy the policy. But to mandate a soup to nuts policy with first dollar coverage for a lot of things is going to be a necessarily expensive policy. And again, a young person getting their first job will look at that and go, I'm not sure I can afford, I can afford this. We should make the insurance affordable, and the Affordable Care Act did not make it affordable. Now, it did expand the pool for Medicaid coverage. So that's the coverage, of course, for the poorest individuals, and it expanded it for the first time to able-bodied adults without dependents. So people who just who don't earn as much money, but who are able-bodied. And one of the things we did in the in the American Health Care Act is just to ask that if we're buying your health insurance, because this is paid out of tax dollars, that we're going to ask you to either have a job, train for a job, or volunteer for something. We don't think that's a big ask. We think that's actually should be part of the social contract. If the hardworking taxpayer is going to pay for your health insurance, we think that if you're able-bodied, again, without dependents, we're not talking about disabled, we're not talking about elderly, we're not talking about women with young children at home, we think that you actually should be asked to work or train for a job. We think that's good for you, and we think that's good for the economy. That came under a lot of criticism because the other thing is that Medicaid, of course, will, the Medicaid expansion, it's roughly going to triple the cost of Medicaid in the United States from when the ACA was initiated to 2050. We think that that has to be controlled. The reports, the government reports say that there's a 15% wastage in the Medicaid program, usually because the states don't monitor it carefully enough. So we thought that one reasonable way to do it is say, what we're going to do is we're going to do what's called block granting to the states. The amount of money that you were getting in the Medicaid program now, we're going to give it to you. We're going to inflate it for inflation. But this gives the state an incentive to actually carefully monitor the program and use the dollars it saves by reducing waste, fraud, and abuse to actually give better and more extensive coverage to people on Medicaid. Again, we thought that made sense. It was criticized that we were going to throw people off Medicaid. We weren't. We were going to make sure that we gave incentives to control the waste, fraud, and abuse. Again, it's 15 cents on every dollar. Hard-working taxpayers who pay for that coverage for someone else expect the government to actually control the fraud and abuse.
Very good, thank you. I know I could ask you questions about this subject for a large part of the rest of the day.
And
so let's move on to
my background,
another one.
I could talk for health for hours and hours.
You also supported the president consistently on the Congressional Review Act.
Yes.
And could you talk about that a bit?
Sure. The fact was that the Obama administration overregulated the economy. And when I talk to businesses, they'll point to two things. They say, look, our economy is humming for two reasons. One is the Tax Reform Act we passed. The other one is the rolling back of regulations. So the Congressional Review Act allows us to take regulations that are less than 6 months old. So again, these were only regulations from the very end of the Obama administration, which we could review in Congress. They're regulations that had to cost the economy a certain amount of money. We reviewed them, and we rolled back a record number of regulations through that. It's one of those things in Congress that only takes a simple majority. So the Democrats could not, and Mr. Schumer in the Senate could not stop us from rolling back those regulations. But that's the tip of the iceberg. The real regulatory rollback has been done by the Trump administration, didn't even require Congress. That's rewriting rules and regulations. Again, to remove the burden. We all know we need regulation. But the businesses, and look, that's why I'm endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the small business drivers in the economy, because they know that my support of things like the Congressional Review Acts meant that we had less regulation, and it freed up these entrepreneurs to actually create businesses and not deal with bureaucrats 24 hours a day.
How do you answer the criticism that you're a physician and you're undercutting the protection of public health because you're voting to roll back environmental regulations, you're voting to roll back health and safety regulations? What reason is there for doing that?
First of all, none of these were major regulations that we rolled back. You know, there are interesting studies done. It makes an interesting point, and I can get you the reference if you need it. There is actually evidence that during an economic downturn, people's health gets worse. So actually, economic growth is associated with better health. And this relationship is frequently forgotten, but it makes sense. I mean, it just makes sense. You don't have as much money in the economy. You have workers who don't have jobs, who aren't bringing as much home. They're not going to get health care as often. They may not be buying their medicines, things like this. So actually, there is a direct connection between economic growth and better health. So the question always is, and what I always have to balance is, will this regulation do more for economic growth and allow us to improve public health that way? Or is it, you know, keeping it in place, perhaps handcuffing the economy for a relatively small protection? Is that better? And that's the balance we have to make. But most people don't realize that economic growth is actually very good for public health.
Thank you. That's a very good answer. And I think it's something that my readers, too, frequently miss, of only looking at one side of regulations. And in fact, that's probably one of the reasons that we have such lack of civility in discussing environmental regulations. One side says this is going to protect health, and we have to protect health down to the very last asthmatic who might possibly have an increased probability of an episode. The other side says you're destroying jobs every time you do this, and I mean, economists are good at balancing those two things, but the debate always seems to be as if only one or only the other side mattered at all.
That's right, and that's actually my job as a congressman, is to actually weigh both sides of an argument. You know, with regards to the environment, you're absolutely right that there are clearly times where we need this. But for instance, if we look at some of the regulations on power plants, for instance, these are drivers for our economy. I mean, you know, there are sectors of this country, and even the western part of Maryland, that deals with a fossil fuel economy, where if you depress it, again, public health suffers in that area. So it's always a balance, and I think people forget that if you look globally, the countries that do best economically actually do the most environmental protection because, as I say, they can afford to do it. Right. Poor countries, which are really the ones, if we look, for instance, if we look forward 2, 3, 4 decades, most of the growth in environmental degradation or environmental degradation is going to occur in countries that don't have adequate economic growth to allow them to put environmental protections in place. And if you travel around the globe, this is exactly what you see. So that there is a distinct benefit of keeping the economy going, because that rising tide lifts all the boats, and one of the boats is actually your ability to afford environmental protection.
Thank you. You mentioned the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and I know that there was a lot of debate and discussion of how that was put together in the House of Representatives, and the Freedom Caucus was not exactly on the same page with the Ways and Means Committee or the original blueprint that came out. But you ended up supporting it. You voted for the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. How did you get to that position, and what were the concerns you had that you might have liked to see the bill look different?
Sure. Look, what we had to do is we had to address two things. One is that I think that Americans are overtaxed. You know, I think that people are tired of paying as many taxes. That's why Larry Hogan is governor. People in Maryland were tired of paying so many taxes. He came in and very successful in lowering taxes and fees. We needed to do it at the federal level. And we needed to do it both for corporations, and corporations and small businesses as well as individuals. So we had to get competitive globally. The fact of the matter is, and I tell people this all the time, when I was in the operating room one day a few years ago, I opened up what's called an endotracheal tube. It's the breathing tube anesthesiologist put in your windpipe to breathe for you. And I open it up and it says made in Ireland. I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. Why is this made in Ireland? I mean, it could be made anywhere in the world. It's a simple plastic device. I mean, we can make it here. Turns out it's made in Ireland because that company went to Ireland because their corporate tax rate was low. Right. That makes perfect economic sense. So we had among the highest corporate tax rates against our competitors in the world. This doesn't work. We're in a global economy. Companies will pick up and they will move to another location if for a favorable tax rate. If you were going to invent a widget today and you were going to go make it somewhere, I shouldn't say today, 1.5 years ago.
Not anymore, right.
Your choice is to pay 35 or 36% combined state and federal and state corporate tax, or you go to Ireland and pay 13%. Where would you do it? I mean, rationally, you can make this anywhere in the world. Ireland has trained workers. They have an educated workforce. You go to Ireland. We had to get competitive. So we had to lower the corporate tax rate, which again affects both large corporations and small corporations, and then we also have to pay attention to the small businesses who operate as what's called a pass-through corporation. They file individual income taxes. So we lowered the rates on larger corporations and medium-sized corporations to attract that business back to the United States, lowered taxes on what I call the entrepreneurs, the small businesses, to allow them to be willing to accept the risk. And then we can't forget the hardworking middle-class families. So we lowered taxes, resulting in a decrease of $2,500 a year for the average Maryland family. That's pretty good. That's $2,500 more that you can now spend in the economy. Not in the way the Obama stimulus bill did, which is to say, we're going to tell you where we think we need to stimulate the economy. It actually gave the money to individuals and said, you make the decision where you're going to spend that money. That's actually economically the most efficient way to do that. So in the end, I believe that was correct. I would have liked perhaps our state and local tax deduction to be a little higher, but we did come to some compromise on the property tax deduction. So in the end, Maryland families still did well. I thought we could have done a little better, but we had to get the tax bill. This was probably our only chance to do this tax reform, and we delivered. And we see the result. GDP growth 4.2, 4.3%. When we were told it was never going to be more than 2%. That's not the America I grew up in. It's not the America my parents came to. I still believe it's the strongest country in the world with the ability to have the best economy in the world, the most innovative economy in the world, as long as we have good trade policies.
But some of your colleagues and some of the Republicans who I talk to here are upset about the $2 trillion increase in the deficit that went along with the tax bill. What's your response to them?
Look, this is a huge argument in Washington because the source of the budget office that makes that estimate, the Congressional Budget Office, actually estimated $1.5 trillion, but it's what's called a static assessment. It assumes that if you decrease taxes, you don't get increased economic activity. Now, if that were true, if the level of taxation were not important, then the simplest way to solve all our budget problems is just increase taxation to 99% on everyone, and then, of course, you could pay off all the debt and everything. Well, that's crazy because no one would work if 99% of what you earned was taxed. So clearly, this is not a static situation. What we saw during the Reagan years, during the Reagan tax cuts, during the Kennedy tax cuts, is when you cut taxes, revenues actually go up. Last month, we had the highest revenue month in the history of America. And it's actually because we cut taxes. Because what we do is we free up economic activity. When our unemployment rate drops to now the lowest level in 49 or 50 years, we have more people paying payroll taxes, more people paying income taxes, more people going out and buying things, paying sales tax. So what we're seeing around the country is actually a tremendous revenue growth. None of this was predicted by the Congressional Budget Office because they assume that if I cut your taxes by $2,500 a year for the average Maryland family, that the deficit goes up by 2,500. No, there's an economic multiplier when that money goes back into the economy.
I'm going to come back to that because I only partially agree with you, and this is actually a subject I spent most of the last 2 years working on myself as an economist. But let's go on to some other areas that those who we hope might watch this would be interested in. You also disagreed with the president about a couple of things. The votes that I noticed were on immigration reform, on the 2018 Farm Bill, and on a fair number of votes that I would say had to do with appropriations or debt ceilings to avoid shutting down the government. So could you talk, and you're facing opposition here, and a lot of that opposition calls you obstructionist for those votes. So I'd like to hear your response to that.
We go from top to bottom? I mean,
exactly.
What are some of the bills? Yeah, what are some of the bills, for instance?
I was thinking the immigration reform bill.
It was voted against by almost all the Democrats as well. So, I mean,
Yes.
if you're going to label me as obstructionist, you have to label the
actually,
Democrats obstructionists. I think that my parents are immigrants. They came to this country. I know the value of immigrants to this country. They came here legally to participate in our economy in a legal way. I think that those are the ground rules under which we all should operate. So if we're going to pass bills that don't operate as that is your first foundational ground rule, then I'm probably going to disagree with it. Now, we may go on to talk about dreamers, for instance. Yes, there are individuals who came when they really were too young to make the decision for themselves. But the question we have to ask is, do we put them in front of the line of people who have waited 10 and 20 years in line for citizenship? So again, on that issue, I believe the compromise is you allow legal presence ongoing as long as you pay your taxes, you work, you get educated, you stay out of trouble with the law, you can stay. But I'm going to disagree with the pathway to citizenship. You can go through normal pathways, but we're not going to create a special pathway when we have people who've been waiting 10 and 20 years in line. So that's why I disagreed with the immigration bill. Now, that's a different reason for why the Democrats disagreed with it. But again, I joined with the vast majority of Democrats in disagreeing with that bill.
Right. Though from the point of view of at least some Republicans, it didn't lose by that much. It probably could have been passed in the House if all of the Freedom Caucus had switched their votes to favor it.
And if 30 Democrats had switched their votes, it would have passed also.
Right,
so the criticism again, this, election year is the silly season. I mean, to say that a Republican who votes against the bill is an obstructionist, but 99% of the Democrats, when they vote against the bill, they're not obstructionist. I'm not sure it's fair to have it both ways there.
It may not be fair, but it is politics.
I fully understand.
Right, and okay, the other one was the 2018 Farm Bill, and I'm very curious about that. What you saw wrong in that?
We had actually there were versions when it was delivered with the food stamp work requirement.
Yes,
I'm supportive of it.
Okay.
We call this the Farm Bill, but it really shouldn't be called the Farm Bill because 80% of the funding in that bill is what's called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, we used to call food stamps.
Right.
Under President Obama, in the Great Recession, we increased the number of people, we roughly doubled the number of people who were receiving food stamps by removing things like work requirements, up to over 40 million people. We're out of that recession. We are back to record employment levels. We have only ticked down a little bit in the number of people on food stamps. We're still about 40 million. We think that, again, I'm not talking about disabled, not talking about elderly, not talking about women with young children, able-bodied workers who are getting food stamps paid for by hardworking taxpayers. We should ask them, get a job, look for a job, work, train for a job, or volunteer. I think that's not too much to ask, and I think that if we're going to pass this, because remember, this is a 5-year bill. These are multi-year bills. We lock in policy for a long period of time. It's time to change that policy. It's time to ask people who, again, we're a compassionate nation. We have safety nets, but when you fall on that safety net, we have to help you out. We don't. We should not strive. Again, you're an able-bodied adult, not to keep you there. We should strive to make sure that you get a job, train for a job, study for a job, volunteer, things that I think that, again, your neighbor paying taxes to pay for that benefit would expect is a reasonable thing to do. So I disagreed with it. I think that it was important enough to say this, and again, because this is the food stamps, or SNAP, are what was one of the fastest growing parts of the budget over the last 10 years. For the long-term future, we have to put caps on these.
And the third one is, let's talk about these perennial confrontations over passing a debt ceiling increase or passing an appropriation bill or shutting down the government. It's not new.
Right.
It's not going to go away. What do you see as being the big issues there that make it worth going through that exercise?
Sure. Well, first of all, the problem is that we have a tremendous debt and deficit. I mean, when I first went in office, I think it was at 12 or 13 billion, trillion. We're now up to $20 trillion federal debt. Right. Our deficits are increasing again. But the most important thing is that our debt ceiling vote is the only opportunity we have to actually put spending controls in, because it's a must-pass piece of legislation. We have to pass our debt ceiling. Mr. Boehner used to have a policy. He said, every dollar in debt ceiling increase has to be coupled with a $1 decrease in spending over the next 10 years, because that puts you on a glide path toward actually beginning to pay down the federal debt. I agreed with that. And when those were coupled with the debt ceiling increase, I voted for them. When they decoupled debt ceiling increases from controls on spending, I had to part company on that. Right. I think that again, hardworking taxpayers, anybody who looks at the books, I tell people, my oldest son is an accountant. He looks at these books and what we're doing in Congress in terms of raising a debt ceiling. I mean, it'd be like you calling your credit card company and saying, you know what? Just give me a 20% increase in my credit limit, and they go, well, do you have plans to pay it back? And you go, no, I just want an increase. No plans to control my spending. I just want an increase. They'd laugh. This isn't funny. We have to take every advantage of an opportunity where we have the opportunity to control spending in what we call a must-pass piece of legislation. Take advantage of it. So I've been consistent on the debt ceiling. If it's not coupled with something that's going to improve our fiscal outlook, I don't vote for him.
Very good. Thank you. You've also taken strong positions on abortion and gun control. And for the sake of full disclosure, I agree with you completely. But I'd like to hear your description of your positions and your reasons for them.
Sure. And they couldn't be farther from my opponent's positions. On abortion, I think that abortion does involve a second human life. I mean, there's the issue, obviously the issue of the mother, but there's the issue of that baby that mother's carrying. We have to do everything we can to protect that human life, everything we can, within the realm of law. So that if we say, for instance, that we think, and the Supreme Court, I believe, would agree eventually because of the way Roe v. Wade was written, that if we say we should put a 20-week limitation, so we're roughly about the half point of carrying a baby. Beyond that, you can't really decide just to electively have an abortion. You can't decide that for whatever reason I can't do it, because society has an interest in protecting that. That's also the time when fetuses begin to perceive pain. So it becomes it's just a different level of development. And again, my opponent thinks it's fine to do that. I don't think it is. I think we have to take careful consideration of that life and protect life at all stages. I also oppose what's called physician-assisted suicide. I'm a physician. I took a Hippocratic oath. It says I actually shouldn't give a medicine to someone to promote death, and yet we're having a discussion about letting your most trusted health provider, your physician, to actually be one who could give you the ability to commit suicide. I think we are witnessing in society a cheapening of human life. And I think that lies at some of the problems that we see society-wide. Now, with regards to gun control, my parents emigrated from communist countries. You couldn't have a gun. There are many countries in the world you can't have a gun. Usually, when it's a totalitarian, autocratic government, that's when these kind of things are put in place. For instance, World War II Germany. Our founding fathers, when they wrote that Second Amendment, they understood the context in which it was. If our revolutionaries were not permitted to have their guns, there would have been no revolution, because the British soldiers were the only ones who would have guns. It was not written for self-defense. It was not written for hunting. It was written as a protection of free people against the potential expansion of authority by the government. We have to be very careful anytime we limit that. Very careful. So, you know, again, I was in the military, pistol expert. I understand firearms. You know, the people who say that, you know, who call these so-called assault weapons, you know, automatic weapons. First of all, automatic weapons are banned already. You can't go out and buy one. A semi-automatic firearm fires just like any other firearm. It's one pull of the trigger, one round. My opponent thinks we should ban assault weapons like we have in Maryland. We should, you know, that somehow would help the entire country. I don't think it would. I think the evidence actually from the assault weapon ban doesn't support that. We had an assault weapon ban for 10 years. It doesn't support the benefit of it. Again, you know, I'm proud of my NRA membership. You know, I think it's the organization, and I'm actually proud of any organization that wants to stand by our Bill of Rights. The NRA is the one that stands by the Second Amendment. I'm proud of it. I'm a life member of the NRA. My opponent's F-rated by the NRA. I'm A-rated by the NRA. That's because I trust law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms. And I think they should be trusted.
Thank you. Since this is a subject that really matters to me a lot, let me dig into it a little bit deeper, especially since you're a physician. A lot of the current action is about both record keeping, making sure that mental health records and other things are registered in the NCIS, and then Maryland's red flag law. Judge can take the guns away from someone if he's well, on grounds that are specified in the law. Now we're getting to issues that seem to have some merit, because we all agree that felons and the mentally ill shouldn't have access to guns, but they also touch on privacy concerns and on, well, something that we see very often, people who have a grudge lying to a judge about some friend or relation that they want to cause hardship for.
Sure.
So what do you think about those? What do you think about that area of gun control?
Sure. Let's talk about mental health first. We'll talk about red flag laws, although they're somewhat related, but not necessarily, as you point out. The mental health is very difficult to navigate because of the privacy concerns you raise. You know, for years, and again, as a physician, I get it. People felt stigmatized if they had a mental health problem. And now what we're doing is we're saying we're actually going to report it to what basically is kind of a not totally public accessible database, but you know, when you check off that form, you know, at the store, and you say, yeah, you know, I don't have a mental health issue. They do a NICS check. You actually do one. Somebody knows you have a problem. The interesting fact coming from Maryland was, and I actually asked the Inspector General of the Department of Justice this question, is this is about 4 years ago, because I used to sit on the Commerce Justice Subcommittee of Appropriations, and I asked specifically why in Maryland less than 100 people were on the mental health deficiency list for the NICS system. And I specifically said, I know that in our state hospital facility, there are more than 100 people there. So how in the world can only 100 people? And it's because Maryland was very, very careful about protecting patient confidentiality. So even in this state, where we have, you know, full background checks, we have very extensive gun control laws, we actually had this little loophole that the state was not reporting mental health disqualification to the federal system. It's hard. This is a hard problem to solve. As a society, we're going to have to make a decision. Are we going to give up a little bit of privacy concern in order for this? And this is a hard decision. This is just a hard decision, and it's not this is something societally we're going to have to because as a physician, I understand the importance of privacy of a health record. With regard to red flag laws, you bring up the exact problem. You have to have due process here. You have to have due process that is prompt and it's effective due process. That's, again, the devil's in the details. We all think that if someone suspects that someone else is a threat, that there should be a way to have that evaluated and dealt with. But we can't trample on someone's, for the very reason you suggest, that a disgruntled person can make an unfounded charge, and it can go for long periods of time without being settled, at which point someone removes your Second Amendment rights. Again, these are Second Amendment rights. These are things that we were given as Americans. We have to be very careful when we abridge these.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's move to another topic. You know their names as well as I do. There are a number of prominent Republicans here in Talbot County who are supporting your opponent. And I'd like to talk to you about some of your reactions to the reasons that I hear about that. A lot of people who write letters to the editor have the impression you don't care about this district. That you don't visit the area, that you don't visit the area often enough.
I just have to interject right there. I actually own a second home 15 minutes away from here in Cambridge. So to say that I don't visit the district very often, again, this is the silly election season. But go on. I mean, look, I get it. They're Republicans. You know, we have a wide range of Republican spectrum. Liberal Republicans are usually not going to agree with some of the positions I take. I get it. On the other hand, there are a lot of conservative Democrats who do agree. You know, you know what this district is made of. I've won in the past with more, 60, 65, 68% of the vote. This district's not 68% Republicans. I have to have Democrats and independents have voted for me in the past because they do agree with my positions. But among the Republican spectrum, you're going to find people who don't agree, but go on.
You're giving exactly the kind of, this is the response, this is what I wanted to hear from you, how you answer this question so people can see that. Let me try another part of that. As Congressman, what would you list as the most important things you've done for the Eastern Shore during this session of Congress?
That's as good a way to answer that complaint as well. Look, if you look at the Eastern Shore economy, and again, look, I ran 8 years ago saying I was going to help the Eastern Shore economy. It was suffering. I was going to help it. You have to analyze what is the backbone of the Eastern Shore economy, and you go, okay, in general, it's agriculture, poultry, tourism. That's about it. There's certainly other industries, but a lot of them rest on that foundation. Let's take them one at a time. Agriculture. I got the Friend of the Farmer Award several times from the American Farm Bureau Federation, including this year. So I've got to believe I'm doing something right for the farmers if the National Federation, gives me an award. And that's because I do think that our farmers have been forgotten in Washington. That the Environmental Protection Agency, when they wanted to rewrite the definition of waters of the U.S. to include drainage ditches that have water in them for a couple of weeks a year during rainy season, as something that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA will regulate, they came to my office and said, look, you've got to stop this. So what do? We put legislation in appropriations bills, because you'll also hear, again, the silly season that, well, I'm not affected because I don't have bills co-sponsored that have passed, but that's not how someone on the Appropriations Committee works. In the Appropriations Committee, the appropriations bills are written by the chairman. Nobody else. Nobody else co-sponsors them. You put amendments on the bill. And I'm one of the most successful members in the Republican Party in putting amendments on the bill on things important to the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So, for instance, waters of the U.S., in making sure that amendment gets on the bill. We have our poultry industry. There's a reason why, again, the poultry organizations in Washington back me, because I stand to help them when they need help. There were rules and regulations going to be put in place right at the end of the last Obama administration that basically would have decimated the way our poultry industry is organized on the Eastern Shore. And as Jim Perdue, a supporter of mine, has said, if we kill the poultry industry on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, it will go to Brazil. It will go to China. It will go somewhere else around the world. So, again, that's why these sectors of the economy actually support me. If you look at tourism, seafood processing, the H-2B issue.
Right.
H-2B, this is an interesting subject because we hear a lot of the president getting blamed for the problem when actually the president only follows what Congress does. Congress sets the quota. When Barbara Mikulski was senator, I worked great with Senator Mikulski's office. She was sitting in the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, I in the House. We put parallel language in the bills. We made sure that although the quota itself was never numerically raised, there were ways around it that allowed our seafood processors through what are called returning worker exemptions. I won't get into the details, but they allowed these to occur. Now, Senator Mikulski unfortunately retired. I think the interest on our senator's side is not there that Senator Mikulski had. So I'm fighting in the House. It was my amendment to the bill that basically solves the problem that's in the appropriations bill that will be considered when we come back and we pass what's called our omnibus bill in December. It's my language in the bill that solves this problem. So to those people who say, well, he doesn't care about the shore, he doesn't visit the shore, he doesn't, just look at the record. There's a reason why, if you watch your TV on another channel, you'll see an ad that Aubrey Vincent did, who owns Lindy's Seafood. One of the seafood companies that got no visas early in the year. She credits me as being the leader in Congress on that issue. So I'm not a show horse, I'm a workhorse. I just get the job done. And the proof is, again, in who is backing me. The National Federation of Independent Businesses. These are the people, you know, again, my opponent, I don't begrudge him. He served his country well, but he says he's a business leader. He's worked for 3 years, never signing the front of a paycheck. The National Federation of Independent Businesses endorsed me because they know that on the Appropriations Committee, I've been effective in making sure and we can get into, again, my opponent's supported by union PACs. I'm not supported by unions in general because I think that every worker should have the free choice of whether they join a union, and fought for that on the Labor Appropriation Committee, and that's one of the reasons the National Federation of Independent Businesses supports me. So whether it's the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the American Farm Bureau Federation, whether it's the chicken growers and their associations in Washington, whether it's the H-2B coalition, the seafood processors, they know what makes this district work, and they're backing me.
This is a good time to go back to, you commented that you did not agree with the president about the Chesapeake Bay. So tell me more about that.
That's a great point. So where the federal government interacts with the Chesapeake Bay is mainly through what's called the Chesapeake Bay program, which is administered by the EPA. The Chesapeake Bay is interesting because actually I think it might have been on your interview. My opponent actually said there's only one district that surrounds Chesapeake Bay. There are actually 7, okay? And actually 4 of them are held by Democrats. So, but I am the co-chair of the Chesapeake Bay Caucus, and when the administration in its budget sought to cut the Chesapeake Bay program, the EPA budget, I fought against it. And I sit on the Appropriations Committee. So, again, in the President's party, fighting the administration to get this funded. Why is it that this EPA program is so important? Because there are some issues in where it's one state against the interests of another state. So in the Chesapeake Bay, most of the bay is in fact surrounded by Maryland, although a significant amount actually surrounded by Virginia. But most of it's surrounded by Maryland, but the pollution doesn't come from Maryland. The vast majority of pollution comes upstream from New York and Pennsylvania. So unless you had an arbiter, a federal arbiter about this, there is no incentive for New York or Pennsylvania to stop any of the pollution flowing down into the bay. So on this, the EPA being a federal arbiter makes sense. And the EPA program also helps our farmers comply with the environmental mandates that the federal government puts in place. So to me, this is win-win for Maryland. Maryland wins because we actually establish the EPA as this arbiter among the various states, 2 of which are the big polluters upstream. And our farmers win because there are actually programs in here that help them do what farmers do. Farmers don't want to, look, the farmers on the Eastern Shore, they live next to the bay as well. They don't want to pollute the bay. And they look forward to the federal government helping them, teaching them how not to pollute the bay. So that's why I fully supported the program.
Okay. Now, this is one where I had kind of a different position on that. And since I wrote about it in one of my columns, somebody might wonder why I didn't ask you. It seems to me that there have been a number of, let's say, conclusions by independent researchers, by environmental organizations, that the Chesapeake Bay program isn't working, that it's not putting enough heat on Pennsylvania and New York to get their part of the problem taken care of, and that the only real way to that solutions are going to require cooperation with teeth. And it would seem that an interstate compact, officially recognized by the Congress, would be a more effective way of going about this than taking taxpayer money from all over the country to kind of pay to deal with problems that are coming about because we don't have an effective way of getting leverage on the states that are putting the effluents into the water.
Sure. Look, I was in state legislature too. I can't imagine New York and Pennsylvania agreeing to an interstate compact. Why would they? Unless there were federal teeth involved. Now, one could argue that maybe there should be more teeth in this, but then one has to ask, this program was actually, run by the Obama administration for a long time with Democrats controlling the program. I guess it didn't have teeth then either. So would I agree there should be more teeth? Absolutely. That's why I voted against the Goodlatte amendment. Mr. Goodlatte from Virginia, actually one of the other parts of the debate, put an amendment in that basically would defang it even more. I don't think that's the right idea. I think in this case, but I do think there are national treasures where we're asking the collective federal taxpayer to pay makes some sense. I mean, there are national parks that are just national treasures, and obviously, Yellowstone National Park probably has a much bigger budget than Assateague National Seashore, but I don't begrudge that our tax dollars go to pay for that national park. Similarly, there's a vested interest in keeping the economy of the region going, keeping the Chesapeake Bay, getting it to improve. So I think this is one valid area, and again, there are a lot of federal regulatory activities I might disagree with. This is not one of them because this is a valid role of the federal government to be this multi-state arbiter.
You don't have a reputation like Senator Schumer of holding his breath till he turns blue in order to get pork barrel projects for his state. But I'm thinking of the 200 or so nominees, many of whom I know, who are being held up by Mr. Schumer with his senatorial privilege. But how do you tell me more about how you draw the line between being another congressman who's dipping into the pork barrel to see how much you can get for your district and picking and choosing what is both in the national interest and in the local interest?
Well, we can't dip into the pork barrel. I mean, earmarks have been banned. I mean, they were banned actually in 2010 when I was elected. In 2011, we came in the House. The very first thing we did is pass new House rules that says you can't earmark spending. I think that's a good decision. I think the use of federal taxpayer dollars as what I will call subtle bribes around Washington in order to buy votes on a piece of legislation is something that we shouldn't stand for. There have been calls to actually return to earmarks. I'm not one of the people calling for that.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things that people are saying. In my interview with your opponent, he slipped in a comment about your meeting with a Czech leader who he called a Nazi.
It never happened. There was a delegation that was going to go to what are called the Central European countries, the Visegrad Four. Now, these are the ones that tended to oppose wholesale immigration from the Middle East into Europe. Right. And we were going to visit those four. I didn't make the agenda for it. And it came to my attention, actually, the trip never happened, but it came to my attention that, it just never happened. So, I mean, you could call it fake news, but it never happened, and I didn't make the agenda. And if it had come to my attention and the trip had happened, I wouldn't have participated in the meeting. It's just that simple. Great. But it never happened.
Thank you. Thank you. Could we talk a little bit about the Clean Power Plan regulations and climate change? you've been accused of saying all sorts of awful things about climate change, and it's a subject I've worked on for the past 25 years. And so maybe we could talk for a few minutes about that. And I'd like you to... I find that one of the problems with discussion about climate change is that it's all very well to ask somebody whether they believe in climate change, to which my answer is, I believe in the creed that we recite after the homily in church. Everything else is a matter of opinion and fact and judgment. But, so I find it very much more helpful to look at the specifics of something. What does a particular piece of legislation actually accomplish in terms of changing global greenhouse gas emissions? What does it cost us? What does it do for other people? And that if you look at, and that frequently members of Congress are condemned as evil and immoral for voting against a piece of legislation that was simply bad legislation and bad policy, even from the point of view of somebody who takes the risks of climate change very seriously. That's my speech, but it's to try to bring out a little bit more of your thinking about the subject than maybe we normally see in the headlines of the Star Democrat.
Look, the fact of the matter is people have accused me of saying, you know, that I don't believe in climate change at all. Or let's set the facts straight right at the beginning. Humans produce CO2. They produce CO2 in quantities that no other creature had ever produced in the history of the planet, but at levels that still don't match what the CO2 levels have been in some other periods of history in the planet. So do humans produce a greenhouse gas? Yeah, they do. The question is, two questions. What is the effect? And can you substantially alter the effect? What is the effect is great deal of controversy, and estimates range all over the ballpark. Most people agree that if you produce greenhouse gases, you will have you will have a warming of the atmosphere. Now that assumes you don't do some of the things that are proposed. For instance, the release of small reflective particles into the atmosphere to reflect heat waves and things. There might be scientific solutions to it, but do humans cause a greenhouse gas to be emitted? Yeah, they do. How expensive would it be to dial that back? And if you dialed it back to that amount, would it be substantively different? Most people who looked at this have to agree that, yes, our trajectory is to continue increasing CO2, but even at the level where we are now, we would probably not, by decreasing the further increase, not have that significant effect, and it would cost us trillions and trillions of dollars to the global economy. So it goes to the question I asked, which I brought up originally, which is, if you keep the economy going, you can do a lot of things that in the end either mitigate or solve climate change. What's an example? I was always, and when I first went to Congress, there's another criticism you left out, that I was never a committee chair. I actually was a subcommittee chair in my very first year. It was the Science Committee, and I was the subcommittee chair of Energy and the Environment. What's interesting is that if you look at, or if I ask you, 50 years from now, do you think we're going to burn gasoline in cars? You look at me and go, of course not. Because we will have invented an energy substitute. And I don't know whether it's fusion, I don't know whether it's hydrogen energy, I don't know what it is right now, because that's not my area of expertise. But we have smart people. We will not burn gasoline in cars 50 years from now. So the question is only, how do you get from here to there a little faster? So I've always supported, for instance, funding for what's called ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Administration for Energy, because these were very forward-looking projects, basic science projects that could, in the end, solve our energy issue. The only way you can afford to do that research, is you actually have to have the economic ability to afford it. This is never going to be done in a third world country, that research. It's going to be done in a country with a driving economy that realizes the importance of scientific discovery. That's how we get out of this. It's actually through scientific discovery driven by the economics that allow us to do that scientific discovery. In the meanwhile, we cannot give up our predominance in the world economy at the cost of tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, seeking the path that says, no, we have to give up fossil fuel. I think we do it by getting away from fossil fuels to the next generation. And the next generation of technology, I'm sorry, is not wind and solar panels. It is truly scientific breakthroughs in developing energy. I think that's how you get there.
Let's talk about science for a minute, because I came across a letter to the SPY yesterday and couldn't resist responding to that one, but it was about an award you were given on healthcare innovation. I looked it up. The award came from a organization that represents pharmaceuticals manufacturers. They have 4 or 5 issues. Struck me that what they had to say about the issues was, probably debatable. I know that, but there are different sides on these economic issues, but sensible. But one of them had to do with protection of intellectual property and the importance of protection of intellectual property for technology advance in general, but in particular for the pharmaceutical industry.
Sure.
Is that a subject you've thought some about?
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. The intellectual property. But let me deal first with the issue of support from the pharmaceutical industry in general. You treat it's treated by some as though the pharmaceutical industry is this huge leviathan, all of which create drugs that are very bad for you, or are not necessary or whatever.
Or they're really good for you and they charge far too much.
Oh, it could be either one. But where I'm recognized a leader in Congress, and it's because of the subcommittee I sit on in health, is actually biodefense and making sure that we as a country are prepared for biologic and chemical threats. Now, the response to biologic and chemical threats, for instance, our soldiers overseas all carry with them antidotes, for instance, to chemical weapon attacks. These are actually manufactured by pharmaceutical companies, and some of the, for instance, anthrax vaccines are manufactured by the companies that come under the purview of my subcommittee. I would be hard-pressed to criticize companies that spend their time figuring out how to best protect you and I from what is a very serious threat. I would have a hard time characterizing them as evil in some way. So first off, not all pharmaceutical companies are the same. Some are actually doing things that we should actually thank them for doing every day, because they, for instance, in that space in the pharmaceutical industry, they take a great risk, because you and I are never, knock on wood, we never need an anthrax vaccine, but they have to develop it and produce it, even though it won't be sold like cholesterol-lowering drugs to everybody. So they actually take a risk. Let's talk about intellectual property, because it's hugely important, because we are the innovators in the world in the United States. This is why, as I used to tell people, you knock on the door at the postgraduate sections in the University of Maryland, and more often than not, a foreign student answers the door, because they come to the United States to learn to gain our intellectual skills. Now, when we invest, when our companies invest in that intellectual property, we have to protect them. The fact of the matter is, they're not being protected. The fact of the matter is that China steals intellectual property routinely. They then go on to produce the drug illegally, at least in our eyes illegally, because the property is stolen, sell it less than our companies sell it for, and drive our research and development out of business that way. That's not right. The President has made it clear that intellectual property theft, especially by China, is one of the goals of his trade program. He's absolutely right in that, because in the end, our economy is the best in the world because we have the best innovators in the world. We have the hardest working people in the world, best innovators. If we can't protect our intellectual property, we can't protect our economy.
Thank you. To end up, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question that I'd like to end up with in a way that doesn't leave a bad taste in everyone's mouth, but it really has to do with the way that views of President Trump are affecting the kind of voters in the current congressional elections. I mean, I hear people, unfortunately, Republicans, all the time saying that they are so they so dislike the president that they're going to vote against you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I am trying to find the best way to point out what the consequences of that kind of attitude are. So I thought maybe you could help me on that.
Well, first of all, my first opinion is that this is what's unusual. And again, look, I've lived, you and I both have lived long enough to see presidents elected who we didn't vote for. Mm-hmm. I didn't take a pitchfork to the streets. This is, my parents came to this country because when someone is elected president here, duly elected, and we can have a long discussion about the Electoral College, mm-hmm. but this president was elected under the way the Constitution said we elect the president, duly elected. The American tradition has been to accept that. We wait another 4 years, we get another crack in 4 years, accept it. What we have seen, and culminating in the Kavanaugh hearings, is an anti-Trump attitude that has gone way out of proportion to anything we've seen. And the president, I semi-agree with him when he says that we're seeing mobs. And they're parts of America. I mean, I think Americans look at that, and I don't think they like that idea. I think they want us to. They certainly know that we can agree to disagree. That's the foundation of our democracy, our Republican democracy. We agree to disagree. But then we come to a conclusion and we move on. There's an inability to move on. In this district, it's a minority. I mean, it's clear. They're vocal, no question about it, but it's a minority. Mm-hmm. I like that about this district. I think that's one of the things I like about representing the 1st Congressional District is these are people who have, in general, a view of America and American values and American ideals that, not to sound nostalgic, that match the way our history, the way it's been over time in our history. I think it'll pass. I hope it'll pass, this attitude. I hope that, again, everybody gets another crack in 2 years, because I think Mr. Trump will run for re-election. I think with the economy going as it is, and look, I don't like a lot of his tweets as much as anybody else doesn't like a lot of his tweets, but the fact of the matter is he delivered. Wherever he could, he delivered. Now, he couldn't deliver on a border wall because the Democrats have stopped any funding on any kind of border. Literally, they have stopped funding for any new border wall, even though Customs and Border Patrol comes in and tells us we need border walls in these areas of the border, not the entire border, but there are areas where we need border walls. And the Democrats have just stopped the construction of any border wall at all. That's wrong. I mean, so the president couldn't deliver on that. But he promised that he was going to cut regulations. He delivered on that. Ask any business person you know. He promised that he was going to cut tax and do tax reform. Yeah, it benefited $2,500 to the average family in my district. Mm-hmm. It meant that now we have the lowest unemployment rate and the highest job rate. In fact, I just saw the job openings now, 1.7 or 1.8 million job openings in the country now. Mm-hmm. Everybody who wants to work can work. Our business now is to get more people to want to work. So that's why, again, I think when we look at the programs we have, the safety net programs, if you're able-bodied and you can work, we should get you a job, train you for a job. That's where we have to go. So the people who are what I'll call the anti-Trump individuals, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, well, nothing he could have done. Let's look around us. Mm-hmm. Let's remember what we were 5-6 years ago, where there were no help wanted signs in the windows because there were no jobs. Now, help wanted signs all over. I talk to business people all the time. They can't find employees now. And it is a result of this president's election, his policy. So, I feel bad that there are people who are so personally opposed to the president that they can't see what is happening to our economy and the restoration of our economy. And we really can, again, we've restored us as the economic leader in the world. If you read the business papers, you read the business section, the other countries, their economies are stalling. Ours is in overdrive right now. I think that's what people, that's what I hope people think about when they think about the president, but there is a minority of people who don't think that way about our president. I think they should. For the good of the community and the good of the district, I think they should.
Thank you very much, Congressman. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for coming and for spending so much time with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.